Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for tuning in. This is your Alaska Weather. Tonight is Wednesday, January 18th, and I'm meteorologist Mike Ottenweller of the National Weather Service. As always, if you need to get in touch with us, you can call our info line, 1-800-472-0391. Follow us online at weather.gov/Alaska. And if you want to get in touch with someone directly, you can use our email, nws.ar.tvweather@noaa.gov, and you should get a response within about 24 hours during the business week. So let's take a look at our headlines. We've got a pretty active pattern that is setting up after our cold and dry spell that we've seen for much of the mainland. Now we're going to start to see things change a little bit. So those cold temperatures going to remain in play for the next several days, especially for interior locations. Not going to be a lot of change for those places, but along southern Alaska is where we're going to see a little bit more active storm track. Our Bering low that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes is going to bring some blowing snow conditions to areas along the Kuskokwim Delta coast and along the Pribilof Islands. And we have another southeast winter storm. In a series of storms for you all, you're going to have one more tonight and into tomorrow morning. And then high pressure over the interior is going to continue to produce ice fog and low visibilities and also some air stagnation advisories. So we'll get into all those here as we move towards our hazard map. So here you can see over southeast Alaska, we do have our winter storm warnings in red and our winter weather advisories in yellow. And these are mainly for snow and some snow and heavy snow conditions. Heavy snow is going to be mainly up near Haines and those places in the higher elevations. And then our winter weather advisories through the night until about 6 a.m. tomorrow morning for the lower elevations, expecting several inches of snow there. For Thompson Pass, we do have a wind chill advisory until mid-morning tomorrow morning, and same for Broad Pass up here in the Susitna Valley. Similar conditions along the Alaska Range, wind chill advisories up here with just this cold, dry air mass and lots of offshore flow helping to produce those gusty northerly winds. And then as we look out towards the Delta, that's where we can see our blowing snow and snow winter weather advisory. There's also one, it's hard to see it, but there's also one in effect for the Pribilof Islands. Hard to see the yellow underneath there, but all those are in effect until either 3 a.m. Friday morning for the Pribilof Islands or until 5 p.m. tomorrow afternoon for the Kuskokwim Delta. Looking at the north slope on the Beaufort Sea coast here, these are all wind chill advisories for temperatures of minus 40 degrees below zero and wind chills expected with the 15-mile-an-hour winds. So bundle up if you have to travel in those areas and stay safe. And again, towards the Bethel coastline there and the Delta coastline and out towards St. Paul Island, that's where we expect the blowing snow and snow. There's going to be a fairly strong system that we'll get into, and it's going to wrap some colder air back into the Pribilof Islands, and with that, we'll see those blowing snow conditions. So just how cold did it get across South Central last night? You might have seen this featured on some of our social media graphics. Here's a good sampling for how cold it was across much of the southern portion of the state and out towards southwest Alaska, and the last time it got that cold. I'll step off there and you can take a look. Minus 15 in Anchorage. Last time that happened was about 5 years ago. Kenai down to minus 31. Last time that happened was again about 5 years ago. And Talkeetna down to minus 32. That has been 10 years, almost exactly 10 years to the day that we saw a temperature that cold. So this is definitely a cold air mass, and definitely take precautions if you have any reason to travel outside, especially as you get further north where temperatures are even colder towards the interior. Taking a look at our satellite loop now. Here's where we can see the fairly active storm system that is developing out towards the Pribilofs. and lots of cold air spilling down off the Gulf of Anadyr, and with that developing these polar vortices that we call them polar lows, and they spin around counterclockwise, and this is helping to push more cold air into the backside of this, leading to a stronger storm developing. This will become the parent storm of all these smaller lows, and we'll see this one be the one that drives towards the west coast and create blowing snow conditions for much of the Delta coastline there. Taking a look at our loop again, you can see over towards southeast Alaska, our area of low pressure is consolidating here. We have two lows right now, but this one will again become the primary storm system, consolidating and pushing more moisture up over top of southeast, especially for the higher terrain, and with that expect heavier snowfall amounts for those locations. Clear and calm across much of the interior, and that's why we do have those strong inversions helping to create a lot of the lower visibilities with fog and ice fog. And again, towards the Arctic coast, pretty quiet conditions up there, just some gusty winds helping to create the wind chill advisories. So let's take a look at our surface map this afternoon. Here's our system developing at 975 millibars, and as it does so, it is stretching this warm front out towards the Kuskokwim Delta coastline, and with that, we do expect the blowing snow conditions to only increase through the night and into Thursday. Out towards the Pribilof Islands, that's where we expect a little bit of heavier snowfall right near the center of the low, and with that, a couple inches of snow and then the blowing snow conditions as it wraps around the backside. Just some snow showers out for the rest of the Bering Sea as cold air moves down there. A weak low that won't really be much of a factor down here in the southern portion of the Gulf. And then here's our storm system out over southeast Alaska, helping to push snow into much of southeast Alaska this afternoon. Little bit of a rain-snow mix for some places for the coastal locations. And then as you get a little bit further south towards the Dixon entrance, that's where we see things turn over to rain. This represents our Arctic boundary, and this is really what's driving a lot of those strong offshore winds. You can see the isobars here are packed in fairly closely, and with that, that means that the winds are going to be moving fairly quickly from the high pressure over the interior portion of the state towards lower pressure in the Gulf of Alaska. So this Arctic boundary really represents the difference between those air masses, warmer air over the Gulf and the cold, dry air over the mainland areas. And so that's why we're pushing that air offshore, and with that, the wind chill advisories, especially through Thompson Pass and Broad Pass. And then we have those fog conditions. We do have a fog advisory in effect for Fairbanks this evening into tomorrow morning, and more fog up along the Brooks Range and out towards the Seward Peninsula. Just some light snow showers along the Arctic coast falling out of the fog. Into tonight, then we see this low track just slightly to the north and really consolidate at 979 millibars, and so that's why we have those winter storm warnings, expecting this warm front to help to push a little bit more mixed precipitation into the southern portion of southeast Alaska, but for the most part, areas will remain snow towards the northern portion of the Panhandle, and thus the advisories and the winter storm warnings. Out towards the mainland portion of the state, we're going to be cold and dry once again tonight. Probably see our coldest night overnight for much of south central Alaska, especially places that remain clear. Places that fog in will have a little bit of cloud cover to help them to stay a little bit colder than what they could realize, but clear skies should mean cold temperatures. Out towards the Pribilof Islands, there again is our system at 976 millibars, and this is what's going to continue to create those blowing snow conditions tonight and on into Thursday. The system weakens just a little bit as it tracks towards Bristol Bay at 979 millibars tomorrow on Thursday, and with that we'll see those conditions start to move inland a little bit towards the Kuskokwim Valley, maybe affecting Cape Newenham and just starting to encroach upon Dillingham. And then lots of cold air wrapping in on the back side of this. We're going to look at that a little bit more in the turbulence charts, because those strong gusty northwest winds really can help to induce some turbulence. Then as we look towards the eastern portion of the state and down towards southeast, our low will start to weaken here over the Panhandle on Thursday, and then we should see the snow slowly come to an end. We'll see those advisories and those warnings be lifted through the day tomorrow. Still expecting high pressure to push those cold air masses offshore, and thus the blowing snow conditions through much of the Alaska Range, and fog will remain in place for much of the interior portion of the state. Then on into Friday, let's take a look at our system out over the Pribilofs, because this is going to be our main weather maker as we head towards the weekend. Weakening now, but still bringing plenty of moisture, and with that moisture, it'll also help to bring some southerly winds back into southern Alaska. So with that, we do see temperatures modifying a little bit on Friday. The coldest night, again, should be tonight into Thursday morning, and then things will start to modify for much of the southern half of the state on Friday. Still pretty cold up for the Arctic coast. And then colder air wrapping in on the backside of this, bringing snow showers to much of the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutian Chain. High pressure will start to push colder air into southeast Alaska, but also dry you out. So with that, expect some gusty northwest winds, and we'll look at that in the marine forecast. So how cold is it going to get, how cold was it this afternoon at 4 p.m.? You can see mainly low 40s and some upper 20s and low mid 30s for much of southeast Alaska. The real cold air was, of course, over the interior portion of the state, with Fairbanks coming in at minus 47 at 4 p.m. Down towards the Gulf of Alaska, 17 at 17 at Cordova, 30 degrees at Middleton Island, and then we generally were in the sub 20s to sub 30 below zero. Out over the interior portion of the state, that's where the coldest air mass was, 51 degrees below zero there, right in the interior portion, and then up along the Arctic coast, a little bit warmer with some of those winds. Conditions were about minus 25 to minus 30 degrees along the Arctic coast. As we look towards southwest Alaska, that warm air starting to push in with that area of low pressure, so conditions a little bit warmer there as well, just between 0 and 10 degrees below zero. And our warmer spots out over the Aleutian chain with some open water, 33 degrees there for Dutch Harbor and 22 degrees at Cold Bay this afternoon. So how are we looking for tonight? Mainly in the low 30s to mid 30s for much of southeast Alaska, unless you're up towards the northern portions there, Haines and Yakutat are going to be in the low 30s to upper 20s. And then for much of southern Alaska and towards the central portion of the state, conditions very similar to last night, even a little bit colder, expecting the negative 20 to negative 30 degree range south of the Alaska range, and then north of the Alaska range between the Brooks Range, minus 50 for the cold spots there. Up along the Arctic coast, we'll see temperatures mainly in the 20 degree below zero range, and southwest Alaska will see conditions around minus 10 degrees. For tomorrow's highs, we'll see conditions fairly similar to today over southeast Alaska with that low there, mid 30s, and generally seeing conditions just below zero for much of south central Alaska. We'll see conditions minus 30 to minus 40 for the interior, and starting to warm up into temperatures above zero for southwest Alaska. So looking at our flying weather now, you can see our most hazardous weather, our instrument flight rule conditions will be out along the west coast, where we do have that stronger area of low pressure. Some marginal flight rules will dominate along the northwest coast as we have that fog up there. And then again, some more IFR conditions here over the northern portions of the Panhandle. Improving for the Panhandle tomorrow afternoon, but staying very much the same for much of western Alaska, even starting to spread a little bit further inland. Let's take a look at our past conditions now. Anaktuvik should be VFR through the day tomorrow. Adigan, VFR. For Lake Clark and Merrill will also be visual flight rules. For Rainy, visual flight rules. Windy will also be VFR. For Isabel, you can expect marginal visual flight rules improving to visual flight rules. Mantasta will also improve through the day. And Tanita will be visual flight rules. Portage, VFR. And our last ones, Chilkoot and White, IFR improving to MVFR. Surface freezing level way down here over the southeastern portion of the state, and thus the cold air in place, not seeing anything above 2,000 feet until you're well into southeast Alaska. For our tomorrow's icing, expect a few pockets above 6,000 feet and above 4,000 feet here along southeast Alaska, and then above 2,000 feet, climbing to 3,000 feet with our system out over southwest. Looking at our jet stream now, moving quickly across at 195 knots, keeping the storm track well south of us, but into the western part of the United States, and not seeing a whole lot of jet activity over us, but still enough energy to produce some stronger low pressures. And there we have our high pressure in the Gulf, allowing winds to come around from the north down to the northeast at 25 knots. And our area of biggest concern is the 50 knots out of the southwest, driving towards Bristol Bay. And that will continue to be the case as we step down to 3,000 feet, still seeing that 50-knot wind coming from Cold Bay up towards King Salmon and Dillingham. And then as we look towards the central portion of the Gulf, high pressure, strong outflow winds will continue at about 30 knots there, creating some turbulence here below 4,000 feet out through the Gulf of Alaska, coming mainly out of those passes near the Barren Islands and Prince William Sound. And then as we get towards southwest Alaska, you'll see that's where we have our pockets of occasional widespread moderate below 4,000 feet, and that's mainly associated with those stronger winds wrapping around that area of low pressure. Stay with us. We'll be right back with your marine forecast.
weather balloons here at Fairbanks International Airport are released by the Weather Service twice a day, and the timing of those releases are such that they are coordinated with all the other releases around the world. And that data then, which provides a vertical profile of temperature and relative humidity and pressure in the atmosphere, is then integrated into the forecast models run by the Weather Service.
How can you forecast the temperatures when an inversion is present? It is a difficult puzzle. In Fairbanks, often the weather forecast says today, clear skies, high temperatures from 20 below to 10 above, coldest in the valley and mildest in the hills. A 30-degree range. This is not uncommon in the interior winter. It's a difficult puzzle to try to put very precise numbers. We need a broad range because within that shallow layer, you go from such cold temperatures to such warm temperatures. That's just the way it is here in the inhabited elevations of interior Alaska. Well, anything you want to forecast, including a temperature inversion, has to be studied. You have to learn how the inversion works in order to forecast its future behavior. And part of learning how it works involves gathering data. And every day out at the Fairbanks International Airport, a weather balloon is launched. On the end of the balloon is a thermometer, up it goes, and we get the vertical profile of temperature in the atmosphere. And that's real good data. You can see the inversion with that. Problem is, the weather balloon only goes up twice a day. And for forecasting, detecting and forecasting the jet stream, which operates on broad spatial and temporal scales, twice a day is for most purposes adequate. However, down here in this fine spatial scale right in urban Fairbanks, we need more than twice a day to really understand the inversion, especially its formation and its dissipation.
So the weather balloons that are released at Fairbanks International are timed with all those other global releases, and they are not actually at times which are very dynamically active here in Fairbanks, which is another reason that we're interested in doing this experiment with an aircraft and also additional weather balloon releases to sample some of those more dynamically active times of the day.
Basically, in preparing the sondes, you have to take the sonde out of the package, prepare the sensors, and then you'll fill up the weather balloon, then need to calibrate the instrument inside. So that's the most important part of balloon preparation. So when we're calibrating the instrument, we make sure that the temperature of the sensor is realistic with the temperature either of the room or outside, wherever the sonde is being calibrated, as well as pressure, making sure that's at our level, and also the relative humidity, that looks realistic. We use these weather balloons that when they're filled up with helium, they're approximately 6 feet wide. And by the time that they reach the top of the atmosphere where the balloon pops, they're about 20 feet wide. So they're huge. It's hard to even imagine. After we get clearance from the FAA, we'll go outside, take the radio sonde, attach it to the balloon, and then make sure there aren't any planes going by just in case, and let her go. And the computer inside actually picks up the signal automatically. It'll tell you exactly when the balloon was launched, and the data will come processing in from there. After we launch the balloon, I'll go back inside the building and to make sure that the data that's coming in on the computer looks realistic, making sure the pressure decreases with height, the relative humidities look realistic, and in my cases, looking at temperature inversion, that the temperature is increasing with height. Typically in the atmosphere, we see temperature decreasing with height, but in these special cases, that's what I'm looking for. And then I can watch as the temperature progresses vertically into the atmosphere, as that sensor's rising, and I can see where the top of the inversion layer is. So the National Weather Service currently launches weather balloons twice a day, but I wanted to launch weather balloons more frequently than that to see what was happening between those launches. So I wanted to take a look at what's happening between that 4 p.m. launch and that 4 a.m. launch, and then what's happening between the 4 a.m. and the 4 p.m. So I launched these weather balloons every 2 to 3 hours to gain a better temporal resolution of what's going on in the atmosphere.
Our research asked the question, what will surface-based temperature inversions look like in Alaska over the next 100 years? And the primary tool for studying future projections are global climate models. In fact, they're the only tool. But they're not perfect for answering our question because we're interested in information over a city landscape scale, which is a few miles, 5 miles, 10 miles. Global climate models provide information on a 100-mile scale. So we need to get that information from this coarse scale and downscale it to a higher resolution so it's useful for us. And the way we do that is we take climate information from the global climate model and we feed it into our regional model, which has a domain over Alaska at a resolution of, say, a few miles instead of hundreds of miles. And the large-scale climate comes from these global climate models, and then we run our simulation over Alaska. We have done regional downscaling simulations for 20 years in the 20th century, from 1979 to 1999. We've done 10 years from 2010 to 2019, and then from 2050 to 2059, and 2090 to 2099. So with the regional model, we've taken these 4 slices over time, fed by the global climate model. And what we find, first of all, in the 20th century simulation is that the regional model does a much better job of simulating the vertical surface-based temperature inversions over Fairbanks and the other cities in Alaska. And as we go through the 21st century, those 3 other slices, as the global climate warms, we find that the temperature inversions in the lowest layer don't really change in strength. The strength stays the same, but the whole profile gets warmer. So this study provides a first look at what would be happening to temperature inversions in the future. We need to ask other questions like, how will this frequency change? Will they occur as often? Will the season be much shorter? There's a variety of other questions we need to ask to develop a better picture for how temperature inversions will change in the future. And our first cut answer that we have suggests that we'll still have to worry about the same sort of air quality issues because in the near surface, the strength of the inversion will be about the same.
And welcome back from the segment. So let's take a look at our sea ice. You can see here a fairly wide swath of our sea ice and our shore-fast ice. And then we do see a little bit of change down here on the southern edge where those strong southerly winds are pushing up with that low pressure, helping to push the ice a little bit further north. But once that north wind kicks around, it should allow the ice to grow back towards the south on the western flank there. Taking a look at the marine forecast now for southeast Alaska, you can expect southerly winds up towards Lynn Canal at 25 knots in 5-foot seas, and then south becoming westerly 10 to 15 knots and seas pretty calm there at 2 to 3 feet. Out over the open waters, 15 to 25 knots and seas generally about 12 to 13 feet. On Friday, we'll see conditions a little bit more intense. Gale force winds 35 knots out of the north for the northern Lynn Canal area, and we'll see gusts all the way up to 50 knots for those places. 20 to 25 knots towards the southern portions of the inner passageways out of the north, and 4 to 5 foot seas. Out over the open waters, northeasterly flow throughout and 20 to 25 knots with seas about 12 feet. For south central, it can expect north and northeast winds over the interior portions of Cook Inlet and then becoming more westerly as you get towards the Barren Islands. It's generally between 10 and 25 knots, and seas are going to be on the order of 3 to 6 feet. Freezing spray throughout the entire domain with these cold temperatures and gusty winds. 25 to 30 knots along the Gulf Coast there, and expect northwest winds with seas between 5 and 11 feet. On into Friday now, see conditions improve a little bit as the winds relax, 10 knots for the most part, unless you're down by Kodiak where you can expect southerly winds 20 to 25 knots and seas generally 2 to 8 feet with a little bit more freezing spray, but those conditions should be diminishing on Friday as well. And then northeast becoming southerly winds 15 to 20 knots over the western portion of the Barren Islands. On into Thursday now for the Alaska Peninsula, you can see southerly winds south of the chain but becoming east and southwest north of the chain, 20 to 30 knots and seas generally running between 9 and 14 feet with freezing spray north of the chain. And then a little bit more confused wind flow on Friday with 25 to 30 knots and expect seas between 10 and 16 feet. Out over the Aleutians, generally westerly winds coming in behind that area of low pressure. Unless you're a little bit further west, you get northwesterly winds. Freezing spray will be a problem out there as well. Winds running between 20 and 35 knots and seas between 9 and about 16 feet. And on into Friday now, we'll see mainly west and northwest winds behind this low pressure, generally between 11 and 17 foot seas, 25 to 30 knot winds, and then our new storm system will bring southeasterly winds 40 knots out towards Shimia with seas about 16 feet. Towards the west coast, this is where we see our counterclockwise flow around our low pressure, generally 25 to 35 knots up along the ice pack there, but down towards the Pribilofs expect northwest 50 knots and seas climbing all the way to 19 feet. And then northerly winds 20 to 40 knots on Friday, seas between 12 and 14 feet. And fairly calm conditions for much of the Arctic coast with just a confused flow there unless you're off the Seward Peninsula at about 20 knots out of the north. For Friday, expect northwest becoming westerly and southwesterly 10 to 15 knots along the Arctic coast. So a quick recap, we see our strong area of low pressure developing. This is going to lead to snow and blowing snow for southwest portions of the state in the Pribilof Islands. And we'll see a winter storm create more snow for much of the interior portions of southeast Alaska. Thanks for joining us.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
If you're interested in serving on your local Federal Subsistence Regional Advisory Council, the deadline to apply is Friday, February 3rd. Call 1-800-478-1456 for more information.